Today, I'm not really going to do a review of The Monster That Challenged the World, though I probably should. I'm going to use this movie as an excuse to talk about monster movies in general and where horror was in the 1950s. I do this because really, after you get out of the mid 40s until you get to the 1970s, there's this flyover country where most people simply don't visit very often. We tend to forget that there was movies made in here that were extraordinarily important, and there's a lot of reason for that. Now, part of this is going to be a little bit redundant to some earlier videos I've done. I fully acknowledge that. But before you write it off as a skippable video, hang with me for a moment, because I think that there's something here that's really deep in the horror fan DNA that we really probably should explore. For me, growing up, most of everything I saw was on a black and white television that we had upstairs. We had a color set downstairs, a black and white set upstairs, and I had control of the smaller black and white set a lot more often than of the color set downstairs. As a result, my exploration of the genre came from broadcast television, but it also came in a very constrained format. Everything was black and white to me, no matter when it was made. So I didn't have any preconceived notions that one type of film was new and another film was older. To me, it was all monster movies or horror movies or ghost movies, whatever. The terms, the vocabulary was not set with me yet, and I'm glad it wasn't, because I was very, very open-minded. I've found that as time goes on, I'm less open-minded, and I think, if we're being honest, we're all pretty locked into definitions at this point, which is unbelievably unfortunate. I've had conversations with people in which they honestly propose that Jaws is not a horror film to them. And that makes me sad, and it makes me worry about the future, because there seems to be an idea that if you hit a certain level of quality in your filmmaking, you can no longer be part of the genre. Or unless you subscribe to a very specific body count philosophy, you can't be considered important in the genre.
Oh, it's that. I can kind of see that as a horror film, but it's weird. It's different.
Well, different is good. Different is awesome. Different is what keeps the genre alive. And going into the 1950s, the genre had a big problem, because before World War II, looking to old Europe for our stories, looking to classic European literature as the basis for our monsters, that is Dracula and Frankenstein, and even The Mummy, although it didn't really have the literary base, it was still talking about the Northern African expeditions, which were, generally speaking, Anglo, that is, English expeditions into Egypt. So there was a strong tradition of tying horror to Europe. Well, coming out of World War II, we had had enough horror out of Europe, and America was just not going to pay money to go see a matinee of something that they unfortunately in real world were seeing on the nightly news for quite a while. So we needed that escapism back badly, but we also needed these films to seem relevant to the time period in which they were created. So what happened is the nuclear panic brought up all these films about irradiated bugs growing to massive sizes and monsters being uncovered by radiation or by other human tampering. It was very timely. But there was also a need for these films to be appropriate for children. And that's probably the biggest stumbling block a lot of hardcore horror fans today have for this period. These features were made to be friendly for 13-year-old kids. Mostly 13-year-old boys. I know that sounds really horrible today, but that is exactly how it was looked at back then. So, a film like Monster That Challenged the World had certain limitations on it. It couldn't be too scary because the world had just gotten through an incredibly traumatic period and was barreling towards a couple more in both Korea and then, of course, in Vietnam. But it also needed to find a way to recapture the genie in the bottle that had been released when the war made our fictional horrors look kind of puny in comparison. Who's worried about Dracula when an atomic bomb has been dropped? It's a different world. The level of the anxiety is completely different. The Cold War horrors would need to be big. We no longer could base the horror in a single family villa somewhere in Europe and worry about whether the doctor who believes in ancient mythology could save the day. Instead, we needed the fears to reflect the headlines of the day. So, Monster That Challenged the World is not unique in any way. It is a story about a nuclear explosion that causes an earthquake undersea that opens up a cavern, and now that it's uncovered, the radiation starts these eggs hatching, and we have monsters. And the monster is cool. It's like a kind of slug monster with these claws on his face, and he's actually a pretty impressive monster, I think, even by today's standards. Inside that black and white screen, this monster is legitimately otherworldly looking, but also something that looks like it belongs in the world in a way. It's not so alien that you don't believe it. The military plot is well, it's very much TV military plot of the day. Everyone's a little bit too polite. By the 1960s, anything involving government had a different veneer to it. It was always a little bit dangerous, a little bit not trustable. But here, the government is still the government that fought the Great Wars. So the officials all have a certain level of trust imbued in them as characters. This was matinee fodder, but it had also just a lot of things that films of this period just couldn't do. We had become used to seeing forced perspective shots, whereas very small insects looked as big as buildings, but we didn't ever really get things like the underwater sequences from this film. I mean, Creature from the Black Lagoon was one thing, but this felt entirely different. Diving into the water knowing there's these enormous prehistoric insect lizard things. I don't think today's kids would be any less involved in this story. But again, whereas this film was made for 13-year-olds and up, today it's probably 13-year-olds and lower, and then people like me who are very nostalgic for how I felt when I first saw this film. Monster That Challenged the World is a product of a time, but it's also simply the touchstone, because this film was so obviously influential for the next 4 decades of filmmaking, and maybe right to this day. I mentioned Jaws earlier. There is a shot in this film of a no swimming by order of the Navy sign being nailed into the sand that is identical to the shot in Jaws of a sign being put up that says no swimming by order of the Amity PD. There is a sequence where divers are going into the water, which is exactly the Ben Gardner boat sequence. It's really the same thing, including right up to the discovery of a body. There is no question that these great monster movies from the 50s had an enduring legacy, not just with specific films like Jaws, but in general you can see it. I would say that when Peter Jackson needed to recreate the insect pit sequence from King Kong, there was very little source material. I can see him looking towards this film very clearly for inspiration of what would have been done in an earlier age. Of course, Kong is early 30s, this is early 50s. I'm not suggesting that it's exactly the same thing, but this movie, along with some of its obvious brethren like them, is just overlooked and not talked about or sneered at, or it makes it onto Mystery Science Theater 3000. And all those things do an unfortunate disservice to a time period that I think was very important in horror. It was the time period where we were letting go of the old guard. The traditional monsters of the ages of literature were being allowed to take a step back. They were still out there. There's still movies being made using those tropes, but the modern age was creeping in. There's shots in this film that clearly show suburbia and air bases and show the military men as real people and the secretary as having a substantial job. You know, she's not just a background character. Her husband has died. She's a single mom raising her kid. She seems to be doing a good job, but it's a tough job. those are modern. You would never have seen that same dynamic even 15 years before this film. There is a sense of taking horror out of the old castles. And that process would continue and not really be fulfilled until horror films were allowed to appeal to adults again. And at that point, you get things like The Exorcist and Carrie and Elliot. But you don't get any of those films without things like Monster That Challenged the World. So dismiss it at your own risk. Now, for myself, sitting on that sofa with a quilt around me, watching that black and white television set, watching this sluggy water monster attack these folks, especially in the office building, the one that patches at the end in the office building, seared into my mind forever as one of the great horror moments of all time. I would actually say it's very, very similar to a lot of what Rob Bottin did for The Thing, just way earlier. It's a very similar aesthetic. Should you, as a modern horror fan, go buy this Kino Lorber disc, or should you find it on YouTube, which I'm sure it's out there, or however you consume your film? It's not going to be a hard film to find in some form or fashion. Well, ask yourself this. Is it worth taking a break from the Conjuring universe for a few minutes to see what built the modern horror world? What took it out of those dusty castle sets from the 1930s? I love the 1930s. It's my favorite decade for film, but it couldn't have gone on forever. And honestly, by the mid-40s, that type of film was very tired. I'm always going to be grateful for the 1950s, even if it's not my favorite decade of horror filmmaking. This film in particular has a spot in my heart, and hopefully it can worm its way into yours.